welcome to the Leadership Learned podcast, brought to you by IDG, the leadership specialists. Each episode we examine the behaviours, skills and attributes required to improve human performance through effective leadership. We discuss the latest thinking and issues affecting leadership from the classroom to the boardroom to provide you, whether you're a student, graduate, middle manager or CEO, with tangible insights to take away and use in your career and workplace as we go beyond the cliches to prove that leaders are made, not born. So this week we're going to be talking about preparing to be a leader. And we think this is something that's not only relevant to those who are new to leadership or a management role, but can act as a useful refresher on the principles of leadership for those who have been in and around those roles for many years. We touch on many different themes and topics in the episode, and some of the key things include how it's not about you, it's about the service you provide, the importance of knowing yourself and the shadows that you cast, as well as really listening and reflecting instead of just going through the motions. We talk about how effective leaders maintain a genuine curiosity and interest in the world around them, and how they also understand the importance of continuing to learn and develop throughout their professional life. I'm your host Matthew Moore, and this week the leadership experts joining me are Nigel Girling and Dr Rona Mackenzie. Nigel has almost 40 years' experience serving in the boardrooms of organisations across multiple sectors. He was CEO of the National Centre of Strategic Leadership, is a former member of the Government Task Force on Employee Engagement, and is an ambassador of the Chartered Management Institute. Nigel also used to be a professional guitarist who played on stages all over the world. Listing Rona's qualifications would take up half the podcast, but they include a doctorate in education, a master's in special education, a master's in business administration and a level 7 diploma in strategic management and leadership. She was a school principal before moving into industry and has had various board level roles, including COO of a luxury jewellery brand and director of BD at a cybersecurity company. Rona is also chair of the Zest Theatre Company in Lincoln. Welcome to you both. So let's start with the big question. Why do people need to prepare to become a leader? It's just a fancy word for manager, isn't
it? In the minds of some that hold the post, I think that's probably true. But no, it's interesting, isn't it, that people often go into the role of manager or leader not clear on which is which. Quite a lot of people who even teach it aren't clear on which is which. It's probably worth thinking about where the words come from. The word management comes from the same root as manual. Yeah, it's from hands. So the word management is about working with your hands and doing things, keeping things under control, under your thumb, etc. Whereas the word leader comes from taking something somewhere, moving things into a direction. You know, we attach a lead to a dog. You know, a lead is a way of connecting things. And these things matter because when those words were assigned to this concept, there were reasons. Yeah? And I think it's not thought about much by a lot of people, a lot of organizations. We often use the term leader for somebody at the very lowest level of management, like a team leader. And then we'll call someone who's got quite a significant influence over the organization a manager. And it seems to carry more clout, but the words actually mean different things. Yeah. Preparation for being a leader starts, I think, with thinking about that. Starts with thinking about what is the job then? What's it about? What's it for? Why am I being put in this position? You know, so there's a lot of things to consider for somebody, and it's really complicated set of skills. Now, if you're going to do it even half well, there's a lot of things you need to be good at. And very few people are going to be naturally good at all of those things when they start. I know I wasn't. I was appalling when I got first put into a senior leadership position because I thought it was about being a boss. So I went around telling people what to do and inviting people into my big office with a nice meeting table in it and laying down the law. And it was very enjoyable for a few weeks until everybody started telling me the truth. The shine came off it quite quickly after that. I got fired 6 months into my first real senior leadership role because I was driving the organization into the ground by that kind of behavior. And I was just fortunate that my response to that was to spend 6 months trying to work out what just happened and reading all the right books. And the road I've been on ever since was really the result of the conclusions of that reflection process.
I think that's really interesting, Nigel, because when I reflect back on my first leadership role, it was mostly of students, a small team of staff, but lots of students in a year group. And actually, they're a great audience to be leading because they always tell you the truth, crikey, warts and all. If you've had a dodgy haircut, you'll be the first to know the next morning when you walk into school. And so in that sense, it was much more about understanding. If you just lay down the law and rules with students, they don't respond well. They respond well to understanding why we're doing things and where we're going and what's it for and what's that bigger picture, and then what do we put, what rules or habits or processes do we put into place to help us to get there. And then so if we think then back to lots of managers are very busy doing things, and often where the leaders struggle is they think that if they keep doing things they'll be effective, whereas actually stopping and thinking about the strategy, the direction, what we're doing, where we're going, that stopping and thinking time can feel like wasted time, but actually it's the most valuable time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that people are most surprised by when they work it out, is actually a lot of the job is about not doing things. It's so geared towards action, when actually listening, sitting back, observing, thinking, reflection, all those kinds of things are actually the critical bits that people need to be able to do. And hardly anyone's good at that when they start. But they don't even know they need to be, usually.
Yeah, lots of diving in and doing things at the beginning rather than actually, I used to always say to new leaders that I'd appoint, just take some time to walk the school as it would have been then, and have a look at what's happening. Properly look and listen and ask lots of questions. So one of my early leadership roles, I was leading a special needs department and inclusion team. And I look back now, I was probably about 26, and I met every single member of staff for half an hour. And my agenda was, I just want to get to know me, to get to know you, tell me about yourself, anything and everything. And all sorts came out, but I felt like I was getting to know the people in their role first, people first, role second. And then through those conversations, as we got to know one another, lots of honesty and trust came out, it developed over time. But without that, just going in and doing things with or two people, as often is really not a helpful start, particularly as everyone's got an opinion about what's worked and what hasn't, and you rock up as the new leader with all your bright ideas and they go, oh, here we go again, another set of it's like when I watch the government, next new minister for education comes in and I think, oh, here we go bunch again. Of new ideas we're going to be on the receiving end of, rather than asking people what's gone well, what could we do to improve, what direction are we heading in, and genuinely leading that team.
And I think something that both of you have touched on there, which is really quite interesting to me, is how much of the success of the leadership role is down to the performance of other people. And whilst that may appear obvious, how many leaders actually don't spend enough time thinking about that.
So it's interesting because actually there's two elements to that. So it's much about the people in your team and their abilities and skills and capabilities, their knowledge and experience. You're leading them. You want to maximize their opportunity to be effective, but also knowing that you can't change those people. The only thing you can change is yourself and some systems and processes. Because I see lots of younger leaders saying, if he just did that differently, it would be okay. And that was said to me once early in my career when I bemoaned somebody who was leading their department in a way that wasn't helping me as their senior leader. And my boss said to me, well, what are you going to do differently? And I was aghast. It's not my fault. So hang on, Rona, anything you can change is you. So there's two things there. First of all, one of the skills we need to develop is the understanding that we are serving our teams. We're trying to enable them to be the best they can be. And by doing that, we need to get to know them really, really well. So we need the ability to develop those relationships, to be very authentic in our true selves, and know our good sides and what we look like under pressure, so that when we show up like that, we recognize what that might feel like to be on the receiving end of. And then learn with people and kind of lead the way, model what we expect from our teams. We want to grow as leaders, so we expect our teams to grow as team members. So that whole thing of leadership and followership, actually we're trying to make a bunch of leaders in our teams who eventually don't need us. When I did my PhD research, one of the school leaders said to me, the purpose of my job is to put myself out of a job because I want to create a school that doesn't need me. And when I've done that, I can retire. Which I thought was really interesting. Yeah, that was his role, was to serve his teams in his schools to enable them all to be independent and highly effective without him.
Exactly right. I mean, that service word is a critical word in all of this, that often people, when they're promoted, don't understand, comes with the territory. Your job is to serve others. And often people think of themselves as being at the top of some pyramid, and actually they're at the bottom of that pyramid. It's the other way up. They're at the bottom supporting everybody else to be the best they can be. And that's a whole different set of expectations and also a whole lot of different skills required to be good at that.
So diving into that a bit further, what are the leadership attributes and abilities that people tend not to really think about before they get into the role, but which become very important very quickly?
I think so. Some of the unusual ones would definitely be around the ability to ask good questions. Often as leaders, we go in with our own agenda of where we want things to go. And so in our minds, we're not listening, we're not asking the right questions to get the information we need. And then when we've asked questions, we're not necessarily listening to the answers, because, when we there's two types of listening to respond and listening to understand. If we're constantly on listening to respond, actually we're not hearing what people are saying, and we're not considering what that means. We're taking them down our agenda. One senior leader I know of in meetings would always be the last to speak and expected to hear an opinion or a view of everyone around the table. And he'd probably got about 10 people around the table, but they would have discussion points on their agenda and it would be exactly that. But he wanted everyone's take. They need to nail their colours to the mast on every decision. And he would make the ultimate decision, but he wanted to understand all of their thinking. And it forced him to really listen. It also allowed them to be honest, because he hadn't clouded their judgment at the beginning of a conversation by taking them down his path. And it enabled them to make better decisions. So back to your question, we need to know how to ask clean questions where we're not guiding people, and then recognize what it means to truly listen before we do anything with the information that we're hearing.
Absolutely. And I think the missing ingredient that goes behind all of that is the ability to think, because you can't really listen to understand unless you give yourself some time to reflect on what just happened and kind of assimilate that information and draw conclusions from it. And that thing you talk about, really, where people tend to listen in order to respond, they'll respond almost immediately. The last echo has died away of what the person said. So they haven't responded to that at all. They've just shoved something into the mix. Yeah. And it's quite hard, isn't it, as a leader, to leave that space. We know from delivering training courses and things like that, the tendency is to try and cram as much information as possible into the space, and leaving time for people to actually assimilate what just happened and talk about what they've just said, not the other thing that you had already got on your list that you were going to do.
When I run sessions now with organisations and teams, I often talk about the need to speak, to say things out loud, whether it's proofreading something you've written. If you just reread it, the brain fills the gaps. If you say it out loud, you start to hear what it might feel like to be on the receiving end. And then also when we have planning days, Zoom, the pandemic's meant lots of people at home, we go online, we jump on, we cram a load in an hour and off we go. But to create time where people can say things out loud and then say, oh, I didn't mean that, or it doesn't sound right, or actually, question one another in that supportive and growth mindset way, so that we can really develop an understanding of why we do things and what's the best way to kind of proceed as a team. The team that we're leading, we want to hear their voices and all their opinions and experiences, so that when we then take action, we've taken the right action and we can move quite swiftly, rather than going backwards and forwards because actually we did this all in a bit of a hurry and it was the wrong thing to do and we've wasted time now. So I think that time is well spent at the beginning, before we start to take action. So the asking good questions, the listening, the thinking, considering, challenging one another's preconceived ideas before we decide on the what next. And then, of course, it's that domino run. Hit the first few dominoes and see what happens. Don't plan to the 10th one, because who knows what will happen, really. Sometimes I think we get a bit too far ahead of ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's often driven by a desire for certainty and clarity and control, which in a modern volatile world is not going to happen. It's a delusion. You can't have any certainty beyond a very short horizon. So what you've got to develop is the ability to respond to change and volatility, which is a whole different mindset. But yeah, absolutely, I agree. Yeah.
I was reading an article about future workforces and skill sets they need if we're thinking about young people in schools today. And it says that the greatest area of development need is dealing with uncertainty. And because nowadays parents may fall into the trap of ensuring that their children don't experience real failure or aren't put at great risk. It's gone are the days, as we always talk about, go out on your bike to play and come home at tea time and no one knows where you are for 10 hours. Those days don't exist anymore. But kids are being kind of protected from uncertainty, and parents sometimes hide the uncertainty in life from them because they don't want to make them feel unstable. But actually then when they move into the adult world and it's absolutely rife with uncertainty, they just can't cope and they don't have the resilience to know what to do. And so that lots of the research is saying we need to give our kids uncertainty and not hide them from it, so that they can have a chance out there in the big wide world to live in the real world rather than the world we've created for them when they're very young.
And there's a whole thing in there about that being part of resilience, real resilience, which often when organizations talk about it, what they mean is being able to cope with doing loads and loads of work without going off sick. But the real resilience is this thing that you're talking about, which is that ability to thrive in a certain amount of chaos and in uncertainty, and to learn from mistakes and to bounce back from setbacks and all those kind of things, because that's what gives you the drive and the tools to kind of keep going through all of this stuff.
Yeah. So Matt, your question around what skills might we develop, we know that if we are a learner for our entire lives, we're going to be increasingly more effective, because we need to keep learning because the world keeps changing and all sorts of new things are being found out. But I'm just on a course at the moment which is looking at how people perform under pressure. And it's got quite a sport angle to it, but it's applicable anywhere. And it's a process to help people when they are under pressure and they feel themselves maybe responding in a way that they don't want to. How do they stop and think about what they can control, what they can influence, and therefore what they can do? And it's quite a nice structure. And I think, and so if this new leader who's got this new post is thinking about, what am I good at? What do I find difficult? What keeps me awake at night? Or what makes me have that little knot in my stomach or the tightness in my chest? I was on a call with someone yesterday and she said it's around having difficult conversations. So she signed herself up for a course, and then we did some 360 review, and people said that actually she was quite good from their perspective at having challenging conversations. I said, yeah, that's really interesting. They think you're good at it, but internally it's draining your energy. So you need the training to keep your energy levels topped up. It's less about them. This is more about you. And so that ability to be aware and to consider what skills and abilities we want to top up and when to top them up, and know that that's a lifelong thing. It's not, I'm a leader, I'll go on a course, job done, box ticked, thank you very much, I'm going to be great.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you were saying there about people not being able to deal with uncertainty, of course, you don't know how you can deal with uncertainty if you haven't experienced it. And similarly, I'm wondering, how can a new leader or someone who is preparing to be a leader find out about themselves beforehand how they are likely to react in a leadership situation, which of course they know nothing about at that point?
A lot of it starts internally with understanding who you are and how you respond to things. Some of the work I've been doing on human performance around mental toughness, this whole thing about understanding how your brain works, gives you so much fuel for this kind of reflection to think, well, because that is how it works. And go back to Rona's point, I'm not going to change that much, but I can change how I respond to it. I can change what I do with that information now I've got it. And one of the things that we've been working on recently, which has been really interesting, is looking at people's levels of confidence, which might seem obvious, but confidence in two different ways. Firstly, confidence interpersonally, so how confident they seem. But then secondly, confidence in their own abilities, which is a whole different thing. And what you often see in leadership, particularly towards the top end, is people who have high interpersonal confidence, but maybe not so much confidence in their own abilities. Maybe because they've never been through that test process of understanding what they're capable of, or because they've cruised, or because they're perhaps an alpha and have got there on charisma and assertiveness. But those things are not confidence. They're a role play that people have learned. I think it's one of the reasons why we have so many people in senior leadership positions that came from the private education sector, because those capabilities are developed in them early. So they've had an expectation of their right to lead from the age of 5 or something. Whereas for a lot of other people later on, they get shoved into the limelight and think, oh, okay, well, they like the extra 10 grand a year, but the other stuff that comes with it maybe doesn't feel quite so good, and they may not feel so ready. And actually that can push your confidence in your own abilities down further, because you recognize that you are not ready.
It's really interesting, Matt, because you're saying, what can people do to get to know themselves, and the kind of work that Nigel's doing around human performance, helping people to understand how well they are, how we can be the most capable, but if we don't feel inner wealth in terms of we call it our mental wealth, our mental health, then we can't perform. How capable are we, and what behaviours do we typically exhibit? And so these 360s that everyone's often, a bit of a sweeping generalisation, but most people are quite frightened of 360s, because we're inviting people to tell us the things we think we don't really want to know, but we sort of do. So screw your eyes up, have a look and see how bad it is, and hope to goodness that they've been kind to you. And so some of that fear of getting honest feedback stops people from asking, whereas that's the most important stuff, is finding out what your colleagues and your line managers and your peers and so on, what does everybody think about the way you are typically behaving at that moment in time, and knowing that that's not truth, that's someone's perception of what they see of you. Now, they might only see you in certain times, in certain roles or activities. They might you might not see a whole swathe of work that you do. It's still only their perception, and it's very valuable, but it is just that. So I always say to people, it's a gift to be held in front of you to have a look at and decide what you want to do next with. But it's the reason I'm so interested in young people and thinking about how we develop their sense of self, because in schools we typically teach subjects. In the very early years, we're helping young people to form relationships and ask questions and listen. We do it really, really early on, but then we almost assume that they've mastered those skills, and we require them to ask questions in lessons. But in some schools, in some subjects, that opportunity is not always there. But there's no way of them knowing how they are as people, other than what GCSE grades they might get, or BTECs or A levels. And I'm really interested in who are they? How do they show up in the world today? What do they find that they're enjoying as a human being? How good is their questioning? Do they listen? All of these different aspects. And when you strip leadership back to the kind of component parts, you realise that it's just about being a person. It's not many more complicated than that. And so if we can help young people to develop their sense of self when they are that young, then my intention is then that throughout their lives, they'll keep looking to see how they change.
So why is it so important to be inward looking as a leader? We've talked a lot about this, and it seems to me that most people, when they move into a role such as that, would straight away look outward, look at the organisation and think about what they can change in that. But what you're saying is to look at yourself first, essentially.
I have a mantra that I've used for 30 years in leadership, which is know yourself, know your shadow, know how to adapt. That's it for me in a nutshell. Know yourself, know your shadow, know how to adapt. So know yourself is the answer to your question, really, which is the first thing people have got to do, is understand themselves deeply and from a number of perspectives. Things like Rona mentioned, the 360, that's one set of perspectives. But as you said, it's only somebody else's opinions. You need more than that. You need psychometric, you need, personality, behavior, communication skills, mental toughness, cognitive fluid intelligence. There's so many, emotional intelligence, so many different things people can do to understand themselves better that are not all that difficult or all that time consuming or expensive to do, that would be incredibly intelligent responses to that set of circumstances. If you know those things about yourself. I was lucky. I used to be CEO of an organization that actually had assessment centers, and I used me as the kind of control group. So every new assessment we developed or took on, we put me through it to see how it compared to the results of the others. So I'm probably one of the most assessed human beings that isn't a serial killer as far as anyone knows. So, because I must have gone through maybe 100 different psychometric assessments and other types of things to try and work out what the consistent threads were. So I found out a hell of a lot about myself. Some of this was a response to my early experiences of being hopeless. But it was fascinating because I discovered that all kinds of reasons as to why I was hopeless. So for me, the know yourself is the beginning. That's the core. Organizations often use some of these tools, but they use them in isolation and usually as part of recruitment, and then file them in a cabinet somewhere and never look at them again. Whereas it's some of the most important information you've ever found out. And if you get that bit right, then you can do the know your shadow bit, which is to start to see how that affects the people around you. What shadow do you cast? And when I started work, almost all leaders were alpha males. That's how the world worked at that time, particularly in the UK. And so the whole way organizations operated, how they were shaped, their cultures, their organizational structures, all those things were actually geared around the alpha male stereotype. It was all command and control. It was all driven from the top. And we've only really started to make inroads into that in the last sort of 20 years of really making changes to that. And now we've got this weird mismatch between the expectations of those who are at the top, who came from that world, and the expectations of those of coming from the bottom, who are of a different generation, a different mindset, and the organization is kind of caught in the crossfire. So that those are the places for me to start, is know yourself and know your shadows, and then you can learn how to adapt.
That's really interesting, because I was just thinking about all that we do, lots of different diagnostics, don't we, to try them out, to see what and I'm kind of fascinated at working out how people show up in the world in all sorts of different times and spaces and under different types of pressure or not. And I feel like if you can move from first, second and third position and look at yourself. So I do things sometimes, and then I catch myself thinking, if I move to second or third, I can start to think about the impact I'm having on other people. And is that what I intended? And am I happy with that? And I think quite a lot of people will, I might be wrong, I'd love to be proven wrong, but not even think about these things. So unconsciously go around in the world, work, do their jobs, not even to consider themselves or the other people around them, the impact they're having. And so if we can get curious about ourselves and get to know ourselves really well, as you say, know yourself, know your shadow. What does that shadow look like? And what does it look like on different days at different times, when you've had sleep or not, when the kids at home have slept brilliantly, or they haven't, or there's pressure or whatever it might be. What does it look like to be with you then? How does it feel? That'd be really interesting if people just develop that, almost a library of knowing yourself rather than just a one-track view.
There's sort of an element of the whole self-coaching philosophy in there, isn't there? That if you can hear yourself the way a coach would hear you if they were sitting in the room, then a whole different set of thought processes can spring from that. And I've always felt that I hear what you're saying about 360s, and I remember being terrified of them when I was a young leader, but they're nowhere near as scary as the feedback I give myself. Nowhere near. Because I know the truth.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because some people give themselves great self-talk, but it's almost unrealistic self-talk, self-congratulation more than anything. Whereas other people, their self-talk's very critical, it's self-criticism, and that can drive some improvement, but it can be deeply unstabilizing or destabilizing and uncomfortable and extra pressure that's unnecessary. And we do typically see, females finding that their self-talk is far more critical, and their expectation that they can't do things to the standard they want to be able to yet. They're still striving. But that extra pressure you put on yourself, some pressure is good and some pressure is crippling. It can lead to inactivity and the freezing and doubting yourself. And that's not helpful. And so I think a lot of watching what you do and looking at other people, I find I'm really interested now in when I do something, seeing what happens and was it what I intended, and watching people's faces. So lots of NLP that I do, and I'm doing some monthly coaching at the moment using my NLP. And a lot of what we're doing is looking for state change on the person on the other end of a screen. So we're not in the same room where you can feel state change. If you just watch someone's face or how they sit or whether the shifts, the subtleties, it tells you a lot about the impact you've had rather than the words that they use. Words aren't always what they meant.
I suppose either way, if you're self-critical or drowning in self-love, either way, you need to hear the truth, and that's the point of the feedback.
I think there's a correlation between that self-critical approach and your level of self-confidence or self-esteem, because the more robust you are, the more you can take the uncomfortable conversations, the negative feedback, all those kind of things, because they will actually help you get better, because your foundations are solid. The problem, I think, for a lot of leaders when they go in is that they try and fake that because they think that's what's expected. So try and role play being confident rather than actually being confident, because they haven't learnt to have confidence in their own abilities, and probably with good reason. They haven't developed enough of them yet to have that confidence. So that's why training and coaching and mentoring and professional qualification, all those kind of things are so helpful, because they build that baseline of self-esteem. You start to trust that you know what you're doing.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about some sort of intangible, long-term things about getting to know yourself, which obviously takes a while. But I'm wondering, is there some more practical, tangible, quick wins that people can do when they're preparing to become a leader? Nigel.
Okay, I mean, the two things for me. When somebody tells me they want to become a leader or they deserve to be a leader, one of the first questions I always ask them is what have you read? Yeah, what books have you read? What articles have you read? What websites have you been on? Because it starts with understanding the territory. So, for me, there are a number of books that fit this, and I know Rona will have her own set of these too. For me, it begins with Drucker. Drucker wrote a book called The Practice of Management so long ago that it's probably written in Cyrillic script.
Well, you're right. I mean, that was Peter Drucker, obviously, for those who don't know. But that book, I think, was written in 1954. So it's a long time ago. So what is it about it that still makes it relevant?
For me, what makes it relevant is the fact that he was right.
Fair enough.
I mean, in the end, he was right about almost everything he ever said about this. I mean, he nailed the essence of everything. I reckon if you wanted to, if you were going to be a leader and you read The Practice of Management from cover to cover, you'd be ready. I mean, at least you'd know what it took to be ready anyway. Because everything that we now know is critically important, he wrote about in the 50s and 60s because he already saw it coming. And the guy was, to me, a genius. It's probably the only book I would say that about, actually. That anything more than sort of 25 years old, generally, I kind of say, well, it's kind of, you've got to take it with a pinch of salt now. But he was spot on, because he talked about the essence of human relationships, and they haven't really changed. And the second bit for me would be the developing mental toughness, which Professor Peter Clough's work on the stuff I've alluded to, how our brains work, how our thinking patterns work, what's going on in our heads. And people can not only read the book, they can also take the assessment, and the assessment is hugely insightful and illuminating. And my third one would be Humane Capital by Professor Vlatko Hlipic. Try saying that after 3 Campari.
Yeah, don't worry to anyone listening. I'll put all the details of these books with links in the show notes, so you won't have to worry about spelling.
There's a connection here in that Vlatko is actually the CEO of the Drucker Society. But she's also a professor at a couple of universities, and she's written a couple of books that have been huge bestsellers in the kind of leadership and management canon. And Humane Capital is particularly interesting because it talks about the shift in understanding away from asset value to human asset value, the whole idea that we have people are our capital moving forwards, and that if we don't invest in those things, we might as well let the building fall down, because we're not maintaining or improving our real estate of humans. So those would be, I mean, I could pick another 100, but those, I can always think the mark of a good book, and I bet Rona's the same, is that it's used up an entire Post-it notepad.
Yeah.
On all various pages. So.
I think Rona uses a red pen and a ruler, I believe.
Yeah, red pen and ruler. I do, red pen and ruler, and I circle the corner of the page numbers if they're ones I want to come back to. So some of these
ruler. Wow.
I know, it has to be straight.
Be very afraid.
I really like Simon Sinek's books, and they are, are overly quoted, and so that can lose some of the value of his work because people dilute it down. But yeah, Leaders Eat Last is a great one. And why, the power of why. Start with why. Start with why. Yeah, really good books just to get you thinking. The Start with Why is exactly, why do we do what we do as individuals, as organizations, as teams? If you really, if you take that book and actually apply it, I think it's phenomenal. And of course, Leaders Eat Last is around that servant leadership aspect that we've talked about.
And the TED Talks of both are really a good place to start if somebody doesn't want to read a whole book. Not everybody does. Yeah. TED Talks are brilliant. In 20 minutes, you get the gist. Yeah.
And I like that if you follow Simon on LinkedIn, he does post and talk about when he's wrong or when he changes his mind about things, or when he, very openly. And I like that about his approach. It's not like he thinks he's found the answer and the truth. It's a perspective. Matthew Syed, I really like reading his work, and Rebel Ideas, I loved. I read it on a plane going out to work in the Middle East last year, and I couldn't put it down. Good job it was pandemic style when you'd got 4 seats to yourself. I could sprawl out and literally read cover to cover. But it made me think really hard about how I would get to know people and really hear them properly. So their diverse ways of thinking and working, how we can actually access that information.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we're going to wrap it up there, I think, and I just want to give a little bit of a summary into some of the key takeaways that we've talked about today. And for me, some of the notes I've made are around asking clean questions, really listening to the answers, and then importantly going away and reflecting before taking actions. We talked a lot about resilience, dealing with uncertainty, and that mental toughness aspect that is really important and is something that can be worked on. We said it's not about you as a leader, it's about the service that you provide. There was Nigel's mantra of know yourself, know your shadow, and learn to adapt. And Nigel's written an article about all of this that we've published on our website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with links to all the books that we mentioned and other things. So all that remains for me to say is thank you to Nigel and Rona for being such good company, and to you for listening. We hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Learned podcast. We hope you found it useful and interesting, and if you have, then please do subscribe and join us next time. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the topics and themes discussed today. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching Inspirational Development Group, or you can email us on info@inspirationaldg.com. If you'd like to learn more about IDG and the work we do optimising human performance through leadership development, you can find us at www.inspirationaldevelopment.com. We'll see you next time.